We're on our 5th week of E100. This week we started with in the wilderness down Mount Sinai, getting the 10 mysteriously passed by, and all of a sudden we were at Joshua, the Jordan River, to get to Jericho in the Holy Land. So we covered a fair bit of time just with one sweep of the narrative. Again, where the people have been. So they started here in Ramses, and God night of the Passover, he, instead of sending them east, he sent them south. And this is the Red Sea here. They would have crossed at this narrow bit. So you can see, even to get to the Red Our internet is having a little bit of trouble today with all the people who are on in our house this morning. Thank you, Michael, for jumping in. So I wanted to talk with you today then about the book of Joshua. So we get these couple of interesting stories about Israel in the wilderness, and then we get the Passover of leadership. So Moses dies before he ever makes it into the promised land. Joshua takes over for him, and what comes after in the book of Joshua and in the book of Judges, which we'll read next week, is some of the history of that time, although it's kind of a strange history. This book of the Bible, Joshua, for many modern readers, we find it one of the most off-putting books of the entire Bible, because the first half is marked by ruthlessness, and the second half is marked by tedium. So it's this really strange book that breaks down the middle in half. It's 24 chapters. Chapters 1 through 12 are these ruthless stories of the conquests of the Israelites as they went into Canaan. And then chapters 13 through 24, they call it the book of apportionments, where the land of Israel got divvied up between all the tribes. And that's heavy going in the reading. That's kind of a tough slog. So the book of Joshua, I just want to give some history, kind of a big picture as we think about it today. The book of Joshua is set in the late 1300 BC. So this is the Bronze Age. This is about the time that Stonehenge was being built in England. And so the Bronze Age technologies, that's when these stories happened. But the stories themselves weren't written down until the 600s BC. So they lived orally for about 700 years before they were ever written down. And the first recorded finding of the written down book was in 621 BC. So 700 years after the stories reportedly happened before it was written down. I think it is worth noticing what was going on in 621 BC. Why was this book discovered as a written down book at this point? Why was it first reported as a written down book in 621 BC? So you remember, between about 700 and 500 BC, there were waves of invaders coming in from the north and the east into Israel and invading the nation of Israel. So in the 700s BC, the Assyrians were coming in from the northeast. And they actually took and destroyed the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes of Israel, in 721 BC. The southern tribes of Israel, the tribes of Judah, they lasted another 150 years. The Babylonians then started coming in after the Assyrians had taken the northern tribes of Israel. The Babylonians started coming from the north and the east. And they destroyed the southern kingdom of Judah in 589 BC. So it was during this time when the people of Israel were experiencing these invasions from the north and from the west, these stronger military nations. It was during that time that this book came into being as a book. It was during this time that these stories were remembered and thought to be important enough that they would be written down. So I wonder what you make of that. You know, I'm looking here and we've got some historians on the call here. What is it you think that makes it the right time for a certain set of old stories to be told and to be written down and rediscovered?
Well, frankly, I think it has a lot to do with hope and expectation and definition. The old stories of God's founding and being with them can spark some hope that God still is with us, and as He massacred all these other peoples, He'll massacre the Babylonians. But also the call to faithfulness. It's a really good message to hear at this time when you're facing a real crisis, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how certain stories, all of a sudden, it's the timely time for a certain set of stories to be told. Yeah. And I think that's exactly right, David. A hope, a return to the question, who are we? What were we made for? What makes us special? What makes us important? And stories in the book of Joshua help give a cultural context for the people who were in a scary and unsettling time in their nation. Now, what's really interesting about the book of Joshua to me is that the archaeological evidence doesn't actually support the timeline of these stories. There isn't evidence that the Israelites came in and did conquest of various cities and destroyed them and killed all the people. There isn't evidence that all these towns were even inhabited at the time of the 13th century. There isn't evidence that that the Israelites moved into those towns during the 13th century. Maybe it was a couple centuries later that they moved into the towns. Just a sec, I see Natalie here. The serrated one, a sharp one. So it's an interesting book that we have of these stories that actually lack archaeological evidence that they happened in the way that they are told to have happened. And so if you can see my PowerPoint, just a sec. Yes, thank you. Natalie's wanting to cut some cheese. On my PowerPoint, I've got a picture here of Jericho. So we read the story of the falling of Jericho, which is this very, ritualized marching around the town and blowing the horn and, a very specific religious ritual. But the archaeological evidence is that the city of Jericho, already by the 13th century BC, the city walls had fallen several centuries before. At this point, when the Israelites came in historically, Jericho would have been a large village, but without the fortress walls around it. And so it's not exactly a historically accurate book, but it is a culturally accurate book. This is a book that's not looking for complete historical accuracy and meaning, but it is looking for cultural accuracy. Thank you, Michael. And I'm on my phone now, which is why you can't see my PowerPoint. So I'm looking at my computer, but you don't get to, sadly. And, you know, I was reminded as I was thinking about Jericho, Jericho is probably the oldest city, the oldest continually inhabited city in the world, 10,000 years old. The people have been living there. So midway through its history, the walls fell, but probably not at this point that we hear about it in Joshua. So another concept that we've read about this week is what's translated pretty often into English as the ban, the stories where the Israelites come in and they practice the ban on the people. They do total destruction. They kill all the men, the women, the children, the livestock. As you read this week, what was the word that was used there in your translations? Was it total destruction, or did your translation use the word the ban? A variety of words. We got these stories as we were going through the crossing of the Jordan and then the fall of Jericho. This idea of the ban, and it's a technical term. In Hebrew, the word is harem, and it's this concept that the invaders would come into the city, completely tear everything apart, kill everybody, women, infants, children, livestock, to completely wipe out the population, to move in and start fresh. And this idea of the total destruction is part of what makes the first chapters of the book of Joshua so horrifying, because the stories are that as the people of Israel came through Canaan, they did this in city after city after city. They did total destruction of the populations in each city. And this wasn't a unique practice to the Israelites. Occasionally, other of the peoples who lived in the region would do this practice. But it's interesting that the archaeological evidence doesn't show that the Israelites ever actually did the ban. They never actually did total destruction to the cities that they went into. So we have these stories of genocide, but the archaeological evidence doesn't support that, which scholars have puzzled over throughout the centuries. Why would the cultural stories talk about this total destruction, this ban, this harem, that, you know, as a 20th century American, genocide seems like a pretty bad thing. Why would the Bible have these stories when they probably didn't even happen? And the reason is that in the book of Joshua, there was something different being accomplished than strict historical accuracy. What is being accomplished is that the book of Joshua is creating a cultural memory more than a historical memory. The book of Joshua is answering the question for the Israelites who are in a time of being invaded by other stronger nations from the north and the east. It's answering the questions, who are we and what were we made for? So the book of Joshua is really sort of an origin story. You know, how did we get to be settled in Israel? How did that happen. And so there's this historical, cultural memory created of strength that's given by God and strength that's given by obedience to God. And there are two theological points that come with this. Let's see. Two theological points that come with this. First, the ban, the harem, the total destruction, is there to create an absolute separation of the Israelites from the Canaanite population. So the idea is that God, from the time of bringing the people out of Egypt, was creating a people who live apart, who dwell apart, people who are elect of God, people who are blessed to be a blessing to the nations, but that requires a distinctiveness of their cultural life and their religious life. They can't be like the other people who live around them. And so the ban, this idea of total destruction, brings with it an idea of religious purity, that we are people who live apart, and so we've not commingled with the Canaanite population. So the ban supports this idea of the separation of the Israelites from the Canaanite population. And the second thing it does is that it supports the religious move that was happening in 700, 600, and 700 BC when this book was finally written down, that all the religious practice was being centralized to Jerusalem. All the temples, beforehand there were like temples on all the hills all around Canaan. Every town would have its own altar to the Lord, and they would worship at their own altar to the Lord. And in the 7th century BC, that was all being consolidated to Jerusalem. So there would be one temple, one altar, one priestly authority. And the reason that this was being done, this was King Josiah, who was implementing these reforms. He was trying to bring cohesiveness and purity to the religion of the Israelites. So when the Israelites had their own temple on their own hill at their own town, they would worship Yahweh, but maybe they had a cousin who worshiped Baal. And so they'd kind of mix it together. They'd mix all the different religious practices together. And so as he went around Israel, the monotheistic faith in Yahweh, in the Lord, was being, the word is syncretism. It was being combined with the Canaanite religions of Baal and Molech and all the other gods who are around. So King Josiah wanted to bring all of the religious practice to Jerusalem, where it could be monitored and centralized and kept pure. And so the idea of the ban was an appealing one in the 7th century BC, because it would help give us reason for this centralization of the religious practice to Jerusalem. So the two theological things that happen with the ban are the separation of the Israelites from the Canaanite population, the idea that the people of Israel are God's elect, they're God's chosen people, they're chosen for a special purpose that's different than any other group on earth, and then to centralize their religious practice to keep it pure in Jerusalem. So the question is, the historical evidence is that the ban didn't actually happen. So where did the Canaanite people go? It was later on in history, they'd kind of disappeared. Where were they? It's like at Roanoke, the first settlers at Roanoke, they disappeared. Where did they go? And the answer is they probably intermarried with the Hebrews. So in fact, there wasn't a total destruction of the Canaanite populations, but an assimilation of the Canaanite population through marriage, through economic partnerships, through governmental partnerships. And so the Canaanite tribes and Hebrew people really came to be one during those years. And, as I'm talking about all this, I think about our own history as Americans, as Westerners, of conquest, of cultural appropriation, of cultural domination. And it's uneasy territory to talk about. It's to me uneasy to say, oh yeah, this is part of the part of the reading, part of the canon of our Bible, is that the Hebrews were engaged in this kind of cultural supremacy. So it's been kind of a thoughtful week for me about that. But what I want to go to is just thinking about the book of Joshua, what it accomplishes as a book that creates cultural memory more than historical memory, and that answers the questions for the Israelites: who are we and what were we made for? Who are we? We're people who belong to God. What were we made for? We were called from the very beginning, from the first call of Abraham, to be a nation that is blessed, to be a blessing to all the other nations of the world. And how does that happen? It happens as we follow God's command and as we stay close to God, and He leads us into the places where we will go. It was striking to me as I think about our own cultural moment. We're in this election cycle. We're in a time when, I don't know if more than ever, but certainly more than any time in my lifetime, I look out and I think, oh, it would be possible for this experiment of the Democratic Republic of the United States to come to an end. That could happen. And I think that the Israelites were when the book of Joshua was written down, when they were saying, oh, our nation could come to an end. And so what did they do? They looked to the past. They looked to their origin stories to remember who they were and where they came from. And I notice I've been doing that same thing in our own national history. Right now I'm reading, I think I have it here. I'm reading a biography of George Washington. Who are we? Where did we come from? How did this nation get started? What does it mean that we're part of this American nation? And so my reading this week has that overlaid over the top, but then even more overlaid over the top of that is the promise that in Christ, we've been called out of our citizenship to just our nation. We've been called into the citizenship of the kingdom of heaven, which is a different and higher loyalty again altogether. And so we're citizens of the kingdom of heaven, and we can ask those same questions. Who are we as members of the kingdom of heaven? People who have been baptized, who have been redeemed, who are in the middle of this kingdom of God that's being established, that is a kingdom of justice and righteousness, where everything that has gone wrong will be made right. And so for me, that's what's been stirring around as I've been reading these passages out of Joshua. And I wonder for you, what's been stirring around for you? What interested you or troubled you as you were reading out of the book of Joshua this week? Well, we're going to get more of the book of, I guess that's the end of Joshua. Next week, we go into the book of Judges, which I really I love the stories in Judges. I think they're fascinating. But what we get is during this same historical period, the story of civil war breaking out in the nation of Israel. All is not well in the nation of Israel. And we'll see this repeated pattern, this repeated cycle of the people are rescued by God, things are good for a decade or so, and then things go bad and things fall apart in the nation of Israel for a period of time, and then God rescues them again by sending a new judge. And so they have this repeated cycle of following God, things going well, falling away from God, things going poorly. And that'll be the witness of this next week. And remember, way back when we were reading about the patriarchs, about Abraham and Jacob and Joseph, this repeating theme of God calls the people for a purpose. They get it all screwed up and do everything wrong. And then God redeems the situation by his goodness and his power, and he restores the people. And so those were kind of long lifetime patterns. Now we're seeing that pattern happen more quickly in this next week as we go into the book of Judges. So it's a good one. Oh, and so on Friday, I want to talk to you just a little bit about the book of Ruth. On Friday, we get to read the entire book of Ruth. And I had always read this as just a really nice story of loyalty and marriage and a family coming together. But I read something this fall that talked about how, because the book of Ruth was written at about the same time as Joshua, and when there's all this turmoil happening, it's actually a really savvy political critique on the prohibition of Israelites marrying Moabites. So the priestly reforms were happening in Israel in the 6th and 7th century BC, and there's getting to be a much stronger demarcation between Israel, especially the people of Moab. You know, the people of Moab, we can't marry them. And so the author of Ruth came in to provide a minority opinion to say, yes, there should be intermarriage. So it's actually a very savvy political book, the story of Ruth. So we've got an interesting week ahead of us.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on. I love being with you all, and I will see you later.